Bitcoin knots is very much not permissionless. Trying to go censor things isn't really going to work. You have your laptop, you run a Bitcoin knots node on that. And that's all you do. That has effectively zero impact. No matter how much you hate on me distributing information I like, you've accomplished essentially nothing. We've recognized that we can't stop this. And of course, I myself, in my own fork of Bitcoin Core called Libra Relay, and this is where things get fuzzy.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, Bitcoin historian and ex-host of the Supply Shock podcast. We're here from Permissionless 4 in Brooklyn, New York. Of course, the crypto development industry descending here for a few days. Special guest now on the podcast. We've got one of the real legends of Bitcoin core development, somebody whose work goes all the way back to 2010, talking about creator of open timestamps and Libra Relay. Peter Todd, best known for his portrayal or his acting as Satoshi Nakamoto on the popular HBO documentary. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you.
So there's a bit of a firestorm these days in Bitcoin software development. I know that's where you spend your time.
Just the annual firestorm. We have one at least once a week to clean up brush.
Right? Yes, It's sort of like how desert environments have sort of one sandstorm a year. This is a sandstorm. So we're seeing something that hasn't happened in at least 6 or 7, maybe 8 years, where there is a alternative software client on Bitcoin. Bitcoin, of course, while it is a digital currency, digital gold, it is a software project, kind of at the base. We're seeing a notable migration of users away from the kind of Bitcoin core project software to an alternative. Maybe we can start there, and you can argue with that or quibble with that description.
This episode of Supply Shock is brought to you by Ledn, a proud Bitcoin-only company and the global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending. Need cash but don't want to sell down your Bitcoin stack? Ledn has a trusted track record in providing liquidity. That's Ledn. You'll hear more about them later in this episode. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
Well, so what's interesting about this particular migration is that Bitcoin knots in Bitcoin Core, they are based on the same code base. Bitcoin knots is a fork of Bitcoin Core, and notably that the consensus code is not changed. And this is very different than previous debates, such as the BCH, BSV, 2 megabyte Bitcoin Classic. There's so many of these things, I'm forgetting what the names are, but you get the idea. So this is not meant to change the protocol itself. This is meant to go change mempool policy. And the way the Bitcoin, I think the way I would describe Bitcoin knots is to say that they think by, they call it filtering, transactions that they don't like, they're not going to end up in the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, of course, I myself, in my own fork of Bitcoin Core called Libra Relay, which I think Greg Maxwell described it really wonderfully as a performance art project to go prove that trying to go censor things isn't really going to work. And then, of course, I take the opposite approach.
Well, I think it's interesting. The theme of this conference is permissionless, right? There's this idea that Bitcoin is a permissionless software that you, as a software developer, can publish anything and run it on Bitcoin without the users being able to stop you.
Bitcoin knots is very much not permissionless.
Right. Well, the view I think of maybe let's start with kind of maybe why this is happening, right? So what's happened is that there are some transactions that are happening on Bitcoin that are maybe not purely what some people would consider financial. They're meant to represent other assets.
Yeah, it's a complex thing because where the sort of firestorm came up is ironically something called op return limit, op return standardness limit, which why people proposed to go remove that limit was actually because of a financial application called Satria, which is trying to go create new ways of basically doing Bitcoin transactions on a different type of L2. There's a lot of techno mumble jumble there, but this isn't entirely unlike Lightning in the sense that if I send you a Lightning transaction, what I sent you doesn't go on the Bitcoin chain itself. It's a protocol that operates on top of it. Whereas Satria is kind of like that. Satria is its own thing that you could do a transaction on. I could send you money that way or do some smart contract thing but the thing we're doing doesn't actually end up on Bitcoin. And part of what makes TRIA works is something called zero-knowledge proofs, where the entity running this transaction system, entities to be exact, if they lie, you can use math to go prove they've lied and punish them in some way, or take money back. I'd have to double check the exact details, to be honest, but something along those lines. Well, those zero-knowledge proofs require data to be put in the Bitcoin blockchain to go and publish widely that this thing happened. And for technical reasons, where that data needs to be is in the outputs of a Bitcoin transaction. Well, what's in the outputs? Addresses, basically. If you put data in an address that isn't real, that ends up in the UTXO set, the unspent coins list, all the coins that have been spent. And obviously, if Bitcoin's going to work, everyone with Node has to have a full copy of all the coins that could be spent. Well, we would rather not add to that unnecessarily, and that's where op return comes in. Op return is just a special type of Bitcoin script, sort of often mistakenly called address, where we say in advance, hey, this thing is definitely invalid. You cannot spend that output. You don't need to add it to this set of data. You can just drop it on the floor.
Maybe before we go into the mythology and ideology stuff here, you can just recount the sequence of events that kind of led you to being seen as one of the principal antagonists here.
Well, so this debate is really earlier than this. I mean, Luke Dash Jr., he has been distributing Bitcoin not since, I think, 2012, 2013. I'd have to double check, but it's been a long, long time. And even in the early days, he was distributing Bitcoin knots versions that would filter out transactions he didn't like. An interesting example of this, when you talk about financial
Satoshi Dice.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Satoshi Dice is clearly a financial transaction. I am sending Satoshi Dice a bet. They decide whether or not I win, and if I win, they send me back my winnings. You can make the argument that this is spam, but from the point of view of the person making the bet, they're doing a financial transaction.
Wasn't there some sort of calculation on the chain happening?
Not, well, sort of no. I mean, for fairness, the way they did the betting was essentially they would have a secret and then use a bit of math to go and deterministically come out with whether or not you've won.
But that wasn't on the chain.
Yeah, well, that was just math, basically.
So these were just pure transactions, though.
But my point is the moving of money had to be in a real Bitcoin transaction.
Okay.
And when Satoshi Dice was a popular thing, real Bitcoin transactions were pretty close to free. You know,
Right.
they were not free, but they were close enough. People didn't really think about it as, you know.
I think there's some data like 60% of transactions that
Yeah,
end up being
yeah,
Satoshi
they peaked at a
Dice,
very high percent. And certainly people could go argue, well, Satoshi Dice should have used a different system. Now, Satoshi Dice would then go say, well, but that wouldn't be the same user experience, wouldn't be the same trust model. You know, we want to have this untrusted, provably honest thing. You know, you can go back and forth, but when you get down to it, Luke Jr. made the decision to release Bitcoin knots, censoring, according to other people, Satoshi Dice transactions. And at the time, he ran the Elagius mining pool, which would also not mine Satoshi Dice. Now, he can make that choice because he ran a mining pool, but other than Bitcoin knots in that mining pool, everyone else said, well, yeah, they're financial transactions. We're going to mine them. You know, we're not going to try to stop this.
Well, there's a bit of mythology at play here, right? Because one of the long-standing things in Bitcoin development after sort of the fork wars, which was kind of the preeminent period, I think, that influenced most things, there was this idea that sort of node runners had a principal stake in the network where that Bitcoin users were able to kind of define outcomes.
It's just not that simple. And there, you know, I would say there's a real asymmetry here. So more recently, there's of course been ordinals and then inscriptions, basically quote unquote monkey JPEGs in the blockchain. Now, again, a lot of people don't like that. And people try to prevent that. But notably, the way inscriptions work is they are, according to Bitcoin Core, totally standard transactions. And standardness in Bitcoin Core has a very specific meaning, which is there's this broader category of transactions, which are consensus valid, and then there's this narrower category, which are called standard. And the reason we have that difference is mainly upgrades. You know, if you're running a Bitcoin node, that doesn't know about a soft fork that happens in the future, that means the scope of transactions people are going to make goes from like this to this. All right? There's people are using a feature that previously wasn't getting used. And basically, like the example is, transactions of a version number.
Okay.
Previously, the version number had no meaning at all. It was just a number. But then when we added CSV back in 2016, maybe? Yeah, but say 2016.
These are the different numbers for different wallet types, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, CSV was a way to time lock coins.
Okay.
And the point is, CSV, we reused a transaction field for a new meaning, which was time lock, basically. And to activate that, we go from transaction version 1 to transaction version 2 or greater. That's the consensus rule.
Yeah.
So if your node is old, it will have the standardness idea that only transaction version 1 is standard. It will not relay things it doesn't know about. And from your point of view, that's good, because when transaction version 2 comes along and then has special meaning, your node doesn't accept something that it doesn't actually know how to process properly. So your node keeps running.
Well, let's get back to the users here and the rights and freedoms that they have, because I think that's kind of that's become the flash.
Well,
the flashpoint
again,
here.
like this is I think where this asymmetry comes in. Your node, you can prevent something invalid from happening, but point is, validity is what matters here. Right? If I try to create a transaction that just takes money, creates money out of thin air, your node is going to reject that. So in that sense, yes, you have a lot of power. But the flip side of you want a transaction that is standard to not happen. If you drop that data on the floor, I can just send that data to a miner somewhere else.
Right. I understand that part. I think what I'm trying to get at here is there are some users who clearly want this ability.
Yeah.
They want this ability to deny certain transactions, or to be fair to them,
Filter.
they want to not propagate these transactions. I think they would prefer that they don't exist. That's ultimately the.
Well, and this is where things get fuzzy. Like one version of this, you could say you have a principled objection to it, and you just don't want to be part of that, even though it's going to happen. I think another version of Bitcoin Knots advocacy is that if enough people run knots, these transactions will stop happening, or at least be greatly slowed down.
Well, their argument is they're making these transactions more costly.
Yeah. And the problem with that argument is, and it's really the problem with data censorship in general, which is internet's really good around routing around censorship.
Sure.
And that's where my Libra Relay project comes in, because Libra Relay, it basically picked some standardness rules and removed them. Not because I think standardness as a whole is a bad idea, just because, I could say, well, the op return limit's kind of dumb. Like, surely we don't need that. So I removed that. But then the key thing Libra Relay does that Core doesn't is Libra Relay advertises the fact it's Libra Relay and preferentially connects to other Libra Relay nodes. So even if there's only, say, 10 Libra Relay nodes in the entire Bitcoin network out of the 30,000 that are publicly reachable.
Yeah, all you need is one, right?
All you need is just enough to get to miners, because they're all connected to each other.
Right.
And some miners are on Libra Relay. Not on their core thing, but on a node next to their core infrastructure,
Right.
And that's enough to get that information there.
Right. With knots, though, it does seem that there's a bit of an older lineage, even in sort of the Bitcoin software project, where some users want to be able to dissent, and I would argue, and I have argued in some writing the
question is, what does dissent mean?
Well, hold on. I think within other cryptocurrency systems, particularly outside of Bitcoin, we see that there isn't a lot of dissent, right? So the whole criticism around hard forks, soft forks, a lot of this was about the ability for users to opt out of certain changes or things that they didn't want.
I should point out that in a lot of currencies, they don't even have the concept of standardness, because they don't do upgrades the way Bitcoin does. Other currencies tend not to do soft forks; they do backwards incompatible hard forks,
Right.
Which swaps out one protocol for another, essentially. Bitcoin has decided not to do that. So if you spun up a version 0.1 node, you could get it to sync with the current chain. It's a little tricky.
Right, but this gives Bitcoin
could.
this property where you can run software that dissents from the popular version.
But the dissent doesn't necessarily do anything meaningful.
In what regard?
Well,
because obviously some people would argue.
Let's say you run Bitcoin Knots.
It signals that you don't approve of what happened.
Doesn't even necessarily signal. I mean, the problem is just running a node doesn't really mean anything. Like, let's say hypothetically, you have your laptop, you run a Bitcoin Knots node on that. That's all you do. that has effectively zero impact. Let's suppose.
Right, this is
hang
the
on,
economic. This is
hang
the
on.
economic.
No,
mode
it's not.
argument.
No, so this is not economics. Let's say that every single person you know, 1 million people, run a Bitcoin Knots node. Does that prevent me from, at normal fee rates, getting an oversized op return into the blockchain? No.
Right.
Because I just publish that data to the people who are interested in it, and they'll just go mine it, and that's that. No matter how much you try to stop data from propagating, you can't actually do that because people
Sure,
aren't
and
gonna connect
I
to
understand
you.
the technical thing here, but I am saying that they're broadly, even if what they're doing is ineffective at a technical level, in terms of social signaling, they're broadly broadcasting dissatisfaction with the core
The problem is they're
development
not
process.
broadcasting anything because there is no, running nodes isn't a vote by itself. Now, if we look back to, say, the UASF of, say, SegWit, that was threatening a very real economic thing because people threatened that they would not consider Bitcoin valid unless SegWit was activated. Now, it's important to note that we do not know whether or not UASF directly
Would have worked,
worked,
right? Yeah, exactly.
because miners gave in. Well, why
I would
didn't-
argue they also lost interest because the cryptocurrency market outside of Bitcoin expanded.
Oh yeah, you make a bunch of arguments, but certainly from a technical point of view, miners prior to the UASF deadline, they complied. They accepted that the SegWit rules were in activation, and from a technical point of view, they're the ones who activated it. Now,
Right, so in that instance, nodes running a software that wasn't activated signaled some intent,
No.
and that caused outcome.
no, because running the node itself didn't change anything.
They call it the hodler's dilemma. Ever wish you could get access to cash without selling down your stack? Well, Ledn makes that possible. Since 2018, Ledn has issued over $9 billion worth of Bitcoin-backed loans, and they haven't lost a single Satoshi of client funds in the process. There are no credit checks. You can get funds in under 12 hours and repay whenever you want with zero penalties. Unlike others, Ledn doesn't lend out your collateral. They even publish biannual proof of reserves verified by top auditors in the blockchain. You can learn more at ledn.io. That's ledn.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
I mean, like this made the hard thing to wrap people's head around. It's the signal there was not running the node. Here's a good example. On my laptop, sitting in my bag under this table, I happen to have 3 different Bitcoin nodes. One I use for one purpose, other I use for another purpose. They're various purposes. Does that mean I have 3 times more power? Absolutely not. But where the power comes from is that I, an economic, rational person, was willing to say, you know what? If you do not turn on SegWit, I will not consider your blocks valid. And from my point of view, Bitcoin's this, not this. Knots is not making that kind of threat. Knots is
But it is threatening to create another implementation process, to create another development process.
which is not a threat. That's the thing. It makes no difference to anyone. If Knots was proposing to add new consensus rules, this would be a different discussion. But they're just not proposing that.
So in terms of if we end up, let's just say the bull case scenario.
Oh,
for
and maybe
Knots.
I should point out one other thing is that from the point of view of Bitcoin Core, I don't think Knots getting, say, 12% of publicly reachable nodes is a threat. I think a lot of Bitcoin Core people would look and say, great, next time Craig Wright sues, we'll have an even stronger legal argument that we're not in control of Bitcoin. This isn't a threat. This is a great thing. It may be a good thing for dumb reasons, but from our point of view, I wouldn't call that a threat.
But what is the positive case of there being multiple Bitcoin implementations that, let's just say, Knots develops?
You got to be careful about your statement there.
Why?
Because Knots is not a re-implementation of Bitcoin.
Sure.
Knots is just Bitcoin Core with some code changes.
But let's say it develops into its own software project. Let's just say it gets funding. Let's just say there's more developers who are added to it. Let's just say if this community sentiment builds and it becomes
It depends on
comparable.
how they do this. One way they do this is they just maintain a patch set of cosmetic changes to Bitcoin Core, and non-consensus changes. In that world, I don't think there's any downsides for anyone, other than maybe the people are wasting money on something that doesn't really matter. Now, in the world where they start doing consensus changes, probably there's no downside because very few miners seem to be interested in running Bitcoin Knots. So if they accidentally fork themselves off by changing consensus code in a way that's not compatible, It's not really, it's not a major problem. Miners have screwed up before and created invalid blocks, and, it happens. It's not good, but it's not the end of the world. Anyone who, makes a life-changing decision on one confirmation, you shouldn't have done that. Wait for more confirmations.
But how do you feel like we got here? Because I feel like in a lot of cases, Bitcoin users have been people who came in, especially after 2017, 2018, were given a certain story of what happened.
Well, I wouldn't say Bitcoin Core gave them the story that they're taking.
I think Bitcoin Core has sort of withdrawn from the conversation, and that's been part of the problem.
Well, this is of course again where things get subtle. The UASF story that Bitcoin nodes are in control with respect to some technical things is true, but with respect to other technical things is not true.
In what regard? The second case.
All right, here's an analogy I could give. Let's suppose you really hate the Expanse.
This was the sci-fi show.
Yeah, that you had no clue about.
Right.
But now that I've told you about it, you really hate it.
Now that I hate it, yeah,
you hate it. I mean, sci-fi in general is just terrible.
Right.
Terrible.
Nobody
terrible
should
stuff.
watch it, really. Yeah.
So you're going to stop the Expanse by spinning up a whole lot of BitTorrent clients, and you're going to really aggressively stream, maybe documentaries.
Right.
David Asbury, wall to wall.
So that people just don't even torrent
wall to wall
anymore,
looking at penguins, adorable penguins, I'll give you that. Does that harm me in any way whatsoever? I like the Expanse. I don't mind your penguins, so I'll run my BitTorrent node and it will continue to serve the Expanse and it will continue to serve maybe some penguin documentaries. No matter how much you hate on me distributing information I like, you've accomplished essentially nothing.
But what do you feel like their critique says about what they want from Bitcoin Core? Because it seems like they are largely asking for the software development process to change to accommodate them.
Yeah, I think the simplest thing to say is that their critique is just technically wrong and doesn't make sense. That's a thing you could go say. They are asking for something that's dumb, and unsurprisingly, people are saying, well, we're still going to do the thing we're planning on doing. If anything, I would say this actually probably makes it easier for a change like this op return removing limit to happen again, because now people have seen that no matter what reasonable argument you give people, they're still going to yell at you at social media. So why even take that part of the world into account?
Do you not sympathize with their argument at all that they believe that Bitcoin should be for certain purposes, and they view Core's inaction as validating certain things? You yourself say that you're not confident in BitVM. That you prefer that the construction for L2s didn't exist.
Yeah, but given the type of thing they're doing, I'm not in a position to stop them.
But there's this imbalance between Bitcoin Core seems to be taking some sort of this medical approach, right, and sort of saying this is how things must be to keep everyone safe. We're not going to take a standpoint on anyone's actions.
I wouldn't describe it that way. I would say this is Bitcoin Core realizing that getting into the debate on a case-by-case basis of what things we're trying to go stop and what things we aren't, there's just no way you can win that. And again, going back to Libra Relay, one of the reasons why I created Libra Relay was I wanted to go show very clearly that this was not a winnable debate, because other people would do exactly what I did anyway. There's nothing special about Libra Relay. I took one patch written by Antoine Riard, if I remember correctly, to do the peering thing. And I got to point out, this peering thing I talked about, I have been I've been distributing forked versions of Bitcoin Core for 10 years for full RBF that did the same trick. So reusing that trick for Libra Relay was just a matter of sitting down for a few hours and copying and pasting some code. There's nothing difficult about it.
But okay, so we have a scenario now where some users are dissatisfied with the Bitcoin Core process. Yep. That doesn't impact Bitcoin at all.
It's unavoidable in this case because what they're dissatisfied about is something that we can't fix. Because they've been spun up to go think.
But that begets the second question, which is if you had a way to fix it, would you? They also want development effort to be put into trying to fix it. I think they would argue.
Well, ironically, in this, I actually was the only guy to bother steel manning this and describing how you could maybe go and prevent arbitrary data from getting into Bitcoin. And of course, I got absolutely no response from the Bitcoin Knots people, probably because the technical solution I talked about, which I believe it was Gregory Maxwell who first proposed it 10 years ago, was just something that obviously we're not going to do because the costs are too high.
What was it?
So basically, you could imagine a Bitcoin where every single bit of data in a transaction, you were required to go prove that it quote-unquote wasn't data, right? That wasn't arbitrary data.
Okay, so prove that the address format was some sort of standard.
Yeah, well, notably, so addresses ultimately map to pub keys. And for technical reasons, some things map to hash digests. Lightning is an example of this. So imagine if all of the data that ultimately went into an address or wound up on the chain, there was a mathematical proof that was either a valid pub key or a hash digest. You could go say that, yeah, none of these things are, arbitrary data, not monkey JPEGs. The problem is, even if you do this, people can still brute force some data in there, and the total cost of doing this is not actually that high. And that's the best anyone's ever come up with. Plus, to implement this, every single Bitcoin wallet needs to go change. All of our address formats need to change. Everything needs to change. We're just not going to do it.
But why not?
Do you want every single wallet, every single QR code with Bitcoin address, every single address itself to all change just so that will make putting a monkey JPEG in Bitcoin slightly more expensive?
Some people might say yes.
Well, they are welcome to propose that consensus change. And like I said, I wrote this
up.
up.
I'm not one of those people.
Like I said, I wrote this up. And the response I got from the Bitcoin Knots people was they didn't even reply. They just didn't bring, they didn't bring it up. And I think,
but let's just say they did that. Let's just say they worked.
Then you would get the cost benefit analysis and seeing, well, maybe are Bitcoin exchanges willing to do this upgrade, or quote unquote upgrade? Frankly, I think the answer there is probably no. But
they seem to be on the verge of listing some of these assets.
Well, yeah, that's one thing too. But even let's say hypothetically you could in fact do all this stuff, would I personally say no to that? If, say, there was no major cost to it, yeah, it'd be great. Go for it. Cool. It doesn't bother me to reduce this risk of other things, but, I'm not personally tied to putting monkey JPEGs on the chain. I just know that the avenues we have available to us mean that this isn't going to change. We are much better off putting our development effort into making Bitcoin fees not matter, so that if monkey JPEGs are a thing today because of some silly, release or God knows what, it doesn't matter to you and I using Lightning.
What do you make of there's a lot of on the kind of side of people who are dissatisfied with Bitcoin Core a bit, that they're making some sort of moral argument. Obviously, Bitcoin Core is a technical meritocratic process that really, I think, shouldn't have an idea of morality.
The problem is, I think where that statement really came from is they wanted Bitcoin Core, in the process of making this moral statement, to go and do something that technically was bad. And people are just not willing to do that. They're happy to go say monkey JPEGs are stupid, or even, evil and scams, but that doesn't mean they're willing to go write code that they know will be at least ineffective and arguably harmful.
But if this argument was so terrible, why did we see sort of the ancient figures of Bitcoin, your Peter Willis, your Greg Maxwell's, kind of come out and advocate for this? Because that seems very new.
Let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Ledn, the most trusted name in Bitcoin-backed lending. Look, if you're like me, you never really want to think about selling your Bitcoin. Ledn has a solution. You can borrow against your Bitcoin. No credit checks, no monthly payments, no hidden fees. You can get your cash in under 12 hours and pay back when you want with zero penalties. Unlike other platforms, Ledn has a history of transparency. They prove it with independent proof of reserves audits every 6 months on the blockchain. In total, they've issued more than $9 billion in loans without losing a single Satoshi of client funds. That's the kind of track record you want when it comes to securing your Bitcoin. You can learn more. Visit ledn.io. That's ledn.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
Well, but you got to understand, what they advocated for was not monkey JPEGs. What they said is this specific thing about op return, we are better off increasing this limit so that the people using Bitcoin for this purpose, and I got to be very clear, monkey JPEGs don't use op return. They use witness space, which is 4 times cheaper.
Right. And part of this is an effort to get them to use op return as opposed
No,
to...
it's not.
No.
No, it is not that. We do not think any of these things, other than, of course, some stuff which is as a marketing exercise, will ever use op return. What we are hoping is purely that the small set of things, like Satria, that for technical reasons need data in Bitcoin outputs, might hopefully use op return.
But some people see that as a decision to accommodate projects like a Citria, and this gets into the history of Bitcoin development. And it's
I mean, again, like we've recognized that we can't stop this.
right.
You know, the degree to which we are accommodating,
But the number of times.
Well, that's a good point. This debate is not new. We went through all this discussion literally like 10 years ago, actually maybe 12 or something, when op return was first added to Bitcoin. In fact, I believe
This was the counterparty 80 bytes, 40 bytes argument.
Yeah. I mean, I am the guy
But the meta here is just to what extent Bitcoin Core should accommodate other.
But I mean, like it's
other
not
things.
accommodating to go
Or the Bitcoin
recognize
software.
that we can't stop something. That's not accommodation. That is just recognizing reality. Satria is going to launch. They have pile of investment money. I mean, they had a booth at, a very expensive booth at like Bitcoin Las Vegas. I mean, they have employees, a lot of employees. They could have big parties. They have money behind this. There's nothing Bitcoin Core can do that is going to go stop that.
But people hear you say that, and they're going to have a negative reaction to you describing.
Oh, I don't care.
The software being influenced by by that
Look,
process.
at some point you just got to throw your hands up and say, look, these people are being unreasonable. It's not our. We don't have to
But
listen to
what
everyone.
what is the thing that they're being unreasonable about?
Well, what they're being unreasonable about is that they think we have powers we don't. That's
okay,
the truth.
this
of
was
it.
the Greg Maxwell argument. Yeah.
I mean, we're not willing to go and do this, and we know that if we try to actively stop these things, partly because of Libra Relay and also because of things like Mara Slipstream, people will just immediately bypass the public mempools out there. And then we have an even bigger problem.
But the argument is often that it's the miners themselves who should be better stewards of Bitcoin, that they should act more responsibly.
Look, Monkey JPEGs as a category spent something like $200 million of transaction fees. Money talks. Like you can say all you want about miners should do this, miners should do that. Fine, go to miners and convince them. Clearly money convinces them. And full RBF is a great example of this. Full RBF was considered to be a moral question for years by a lot of people. It was
right, because
moral.
zero comp transactions.
Exactly.
It was seen as breaking Bitcoin.
Even recently, when it was proposed to make full RBF by default, or for that matter,
the allegation was it was a double spend. It was a double spend essentially.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even recently, when there was the move to go add the full RBF option, default off, and B, there were people trying to get that option removed from Bitcoin Core so that you could not turn on full RBF easily. That was still, even just 2 years ago, considered to be a big moral debate by a lot of people. And what happened in reality was, due to how auctions for ordinals type protocols work, turning on full RBF meant you made more money. On the tune of at least a couple $100 per block extra. What happened? Well, one miner turned it on. In that case, they turned it on because they didn't like, I forget his name, but one of the people was like really vocal about full RBF being evil. Well, of course, once one...
John Carvalho?
Yeah,
maybe?
John Carvalho, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like the Luxor guys...
I got that Jeopardy question right.
Yeah, the Luxor guy straight up said, we thought that guy was an asshole, so we're happy to go turn on full RBF. Of course, once one person does it, other miners notice, oh, yeah, this is happening. And, oh, that's interesting. They're making a little more money. Of course, then another mining pool turns it on. Then another one turns it on. And before long, the biggest mining pools, it all turned it on. And did I have to go and advocate for that much? No. I went to some conferences and told people in booths, hey, you're going to make more money this way. Someone, oh yeah, cool. I don't think I ever actually talked to Foundry or Antpool about this, but they looked at the money being made and they turned it on. Why wouldn't you earn that more money?
Quick shout out to John Carvalho because I'm a big John Carvalho fan.
And I got to point out too that, like I said, full RBF's been this many, many years debate. There was, I think, probably at the peak prior to this, probably as much as maybe 5% hash power at some times running full RBF. And again, I had clients, full RBF peering clients
Right.
that would peer with each other and roll RB if worked. Because of, frankly, my own
But
laziness,
the
that didn't work
the
for a
argument
while.
here is that, and again, I'm still manning their position, is that these are fiat incentives. The miners shouldn't be driven by profit motives. They should be driven by Bitcoin's best long-term interests.
Look, they got electric bills to pay, and it's,
So how do you view miners? Are they outside the system then? Are they part of the system? Like, because if Bitcoin is a completely insular economic system.
the way I would say is, first of all, not everyone agrees that monkey JPEGs are bad. There are plenty of miners who think this is good for Bitcoin.
Sure. Yeah.
There are plenty of people who thought full
I've
RBF
tried to
was
make
good for Bitcoin.
positivistic arguments for ordinals. Yeah.
And like the simple fact of the matter is, there's going to be some people who do not agree with this, or do not agree with this. This is definitely a bad thing. And there's plenty of people who are agnostic enough; they're still willing to accept money and do it. And if a small percentage of miners do one thing, and then they earn a bunch more money for it, of course, more miners are going to turn it on.
But this goes back to sort of the old conflict of the 2017 era, where miners were seen as the antagonists. They were seen as a group that was sort of socially punished for their behavior, and that the users specifically enacted that punishment.
They could do that because they were willing to potentially make a consensus change. UASF was a consensus change. Until the Bitcoin Knots guys come up with a principled way to use with consensus, stop monkey JPEGs, this discussion really goes nowhere. And I gave them that way, but the fact is, for technical reasons, it is just not feasible to stop people from putting data in Bitcoin transactions.
Because it seems like what they're
In
saying
fact,
is,
in fact, I got to point out, this is actually a little worse than that, which is, remember, Luke Jr. did, after all, try to stop Satoshi Dice. These people also hate ordinals. Because remember, ordinals and inscriptions are different things.
Of course, yeah.
Ordinals
just
are just
numbered,
normal
yeah,
Bitcoin
normal Bitcoin,
transactions
yeah.
that people choose to view differently. They would love to stop ordinal transactions, but there is no principled technical way where you could possibly say one thing's an ordinal and one isn't.
Right.
Right?
It's just an arbitrary number system.
Yeah. If RGB, for instance, catches on, the way RGB moves tokens around is effectively indistinguishable from a normal Bitcoin transaction. It's, it embeds data not by actually putting data in the chain, but rather by committing to data. But it does mean that a Bitcoin transaction might be moving, $1 million worth of USD, and there's just no way to look at it and see that's happening.
But how does this scale, right? So let me just preface this question. Like, in order for Bitcoin to scale as a system that people use, we've had to dumb down the messaging considerably, right? 21 million Cyber Hornets, it's up forever.
I don't think that's necessarily a have to. I think that's just end up happening.
That's what's happened, right?
Well, it's the thing that naturally happens as more people get in.
But you see Bitcoin as this complex technical system that has all these myriad of properties and things
it's
like
just how it is.
right. But is this the actual difference? Is some people want things to be...
I do not think this is it.
People want things to be a certain way versus how you're just saying this is how they are.
I think the biggest thing going on here is that Ocean's not being very successful and they need a marketing pitch. And this is a thing they've latched onto to try to be different. Like, how does Ocean compete with other pools? Well, one way is to go create a narrative around there. We are these different people. You should send your hash price up even though you're actually going to earn less money. Yeah,
their argument is that they...
Yeah, and that argument is total bullshit. It's kind of like arguing that life insurance is stupid because the premiums cost more. But I'm sorry, having life insurance is just fundamentally different than not. Having full pay per share is a fundamentally different financial product than not. And I know plenty of miners who have electrical bills. They come in and they got to get them paid, and reducing that risk ultimately saves them money because they're borrowing less. You can make a financial argument that maybe they're overestimating the risks and maybe they should do this, and this separately. But these are dumb people.
Every way that I square this, it's always one side saying that things should be this way. Miners should be altruistic and support the protocol. Developers should not be getting money from maybe these kind of foundations that are giving them grants. There's a lot of shoulds versus you saying this is how it is. So, but why can't, from their point of view, why can't the Bitcoin core developers make Bitcoin more aligned to what users want?
Because they're asking for something that's technically impossible. Like, that's your answer. And Bitcoin Core developers do not want to waste their time doing, chasing after dreams that are not technically feasible.
But is the claim that Bitcoin is money is not a technically infeasible dream?
That's not what we're talking about here. What we're actually talking about is people trying to not just, point is, Bitcoin is certainly money, end of story. If people put JPEGs on the blockchain, it's still money. People are just using it for another purpose. I personally have open timestamps. Does the creation of open timestamps change the fact that Bitcoin is money? No.
I don't think so, but their argument is that it makes it worse.
Well, look.
And to what extent are they entitled to voice that opinion is kind of the question.
They can voice opinion all they want, but it isn't going to change the fact that Bitcoin developers, in Bitcoin Core, have chosen not to waste their time.
It has a
trying
second
to
order
stop
effect,
this.
right? Where I think some other people are saying, and there's this common refrain.
You can make that argument all you want, but Bitcoin Core is not promoting this thing. We are just deciding we choose not to actively try to go stop these things.
Well, what I was going to say is that there's this idea that users might withhold some sort of upgrades, right? With this idea that Bitcoin, sure.
Don't run the latest version, fine. Mm-hmm. Like I said before, I don't think people in Bitcoin Core actually care if a bunch of users, for their own silly anger reasons, whatever, run Bitcoin knots. I think it's a good thing legally for the legal situation of Bitcoin Core developers potentially getting sued. Remember, I was sued by Craig Wright. Technically, I think, 3 different lawsuits or something? It's hard to keep track. But in our legal defense, Bitcoin knots existing was important. And Bitcoin knots being more of a thing makes for a better defense in that case. I think there's certainly downsides to Bitcoin knots where, because basically the development's one person, it would not be surprising if it eventually gets hacked or something terrible happens there, but it'll affect the people running Bitcoin knots. The nature of Bitcoin is that if, say, 10% of the nodes just go offline tomorrow, for the most part, everything's fine.
Since we're wrapping up, winding down, the last question that I would enter into is this idea that I think early on in the Bitcoin story, there was this idea that the development of Bitcoin as a software protocol was meaningful for its price. There was probably some period where technical development was seen as a principal driver of the Bitcoin price appreciation. I would argue that isn't true anymore. What is your view of that relationship?
Well, there's an asymmetry here, which is bad, incompetent technical development can certainly drag down the price, but Bitcoin Core itself, you got to understand the Bitcoin protocol is relatively mature. There's not that much that's likely to wind up changing. Potentially, say, CTV or things like it. But the upside, I think, for price tends to be things that you build on top of that protocol, Lightning being probably your most successful example.
You think there was a material relationship between the price of Bitcoin and Lightning's development?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, Bitcoin has a better story for price appreciation now that Lightning exists. Now, price appreciation is a tricky thing because that's not very directly driven by retail. That's mostly driven by people holding onto Bitcoin, but certainly a better story if Bitcoin is feasible to go use more widely than just buying a bunch of it and holding it. And potentially, there's a story there for things like Satria and BitVM-related stuff. I'm less convinced by that, but the point there is they're doing their thing without permission. Bitcoin Core has basically nothing to do with whether or not BitVM happens.
When do you think that stopped, though? If you're...
quite a while back.
And do you
again, I think the rise of L2s was the biggest thing.
Do you accept that if I was to make the claim that when Satoshi and maybe even Gavin Andreessen were working on the software in 2009, 2010, their development actions had a material impact on the price of Bitcoin?
Yeah.
You think that's true? Okay, so then the question then is when does that stop?
Well, it's not that it stopped. It's became
or when
less,
does it? Yeah, right.
Well, I'd say the thing that began to make that change the most was the development of L2s, precisely because the engineering challenges of Bitcoin became more and more about things that are not directly Bitcoin Core. And you could kind of say the activation of SegWit was a very important moment there, because that was us building the bedrock, if you will, to create Lightning and other protocols in a reasonable way. Taproot helped as well, but less so because Taproot wasn't strictly necessary for Lightning. And potentially when CTV happens, it'll be, or something like CTV, it would be like another step in that general direction.
Well, I've asked this question to a number of people in the podcast recently, like James O'Byrne, Matt Corallo, and others. There does seem like there's this appeal among some Bitcoin developers that there was once a grand vision. There was this dream that was Rome. You can see evidence of this in the software, right? This idea that we enacted certain changes to make it possible to deploy multiple soft forks at once, right? This is basically the assumption that maybe you would live in a future where there would be multiple Bitcoin soft forks being deployed at once.
I don't think that's actually a good argument. I remember that change way back in the day, and I didn't think it made that much sense because the idea of trying to do multiple ones at once sounded like that's more coordination.
That's evidence of some social belief
But
that
no,
there would be.
But the point is, it's not evidence necessarily that everyone believed that. I think, and also I got to point out that doesn't necessarily mean that. Well, because I should say, the multiple soft forks at once thing. Remember, that is not multiple soft forks that are guaranteed to activate.
Sure, but they're being proposed in parallel.
Right, but one way you can go look at it is that's not because we want to do 5 things at once and really advance the protocol really quickly, but also that, well, what if we just disagree about what direction to go in? Maybe we want to have 3 soft forks proposed at once, but we only ever think one's going to activate.
Mm-hmm. Right, but it's a relic from, I think, a period where the expectation was that the changes to the software would be much more active, and so I guess the question.
I don't think that's a great argument there.
But,
one reason why I say this was, at that time, I think there was people were expecting much more controversy around like activation and stuff, and also potentially a more structured process for doing this. Like, I think, it's fair to say people were maybe a little naive about how the politics of this would play out, where, maybe you could have a relatively okay process where, like, there's 3 proposals and you only expect 1 to activate, but everyone's nice about it. Whereas it turned into much more of a stronger battle because people had strong incentives. SegWit being an interesting one where the biggest miners actually were screwed over by SegWit in ways we had no idea about to do ASIC boost. And they had strong incentives for it to not activate because they wanted to hide the fact that they were actually using ASIC boost in secret.
Right. Eric Wall had a really interesting answer to this question where he said, I would define kind of the dream of the development of that period. I know you guys have your back and forths. As, there was this dream that Bitcoin would be infinitely scalable. You'd be able to download a node in very, very a short amount of time, and Bitcoin would be very private. So he was sort of saying, these were the great white whales of the past.
I mean, we did very well on that.
Okay.
Lightning makes Bitcoin extremely scalable. It makes it actually very private, and it makes it actually a reasonably good user experience.
So your argument would be maybe enough was done.
Well, no, I think my argument there is Eric Wall makes up a bunch of stuff because he wants to present a certain type of narrative. Like, I think he is one of these sort of people who is willing to go lie about things like Lightning because it fits his narrative, that Bitcoin is stuck and so on. Whereas I would say Bitcoin's actually doing very well. Lightning's a great example of this. We're making a ton of progress. It doesn't necessarily mean we can, scale to like all 10 billion people on the planet. But as I've argued, say in my recent L2 blog post, the world isn't even that big. I mean, only like 4 billion people own smartphones. We're not going to scale to 10 because that's just nuts. And the fact we can seemingly scale to hundreds of millions is actually really good. And we can probably do even better with things like ARC, but there isn't a strong rush to this. We have something that's very good. I'd say the biggest challenge for Bitcoin in terms of getting in the hands of everyone for everyday commerce has nothing to do with all this tech stuff. It's that USDT gets you price stability. And when you look at places which actually need cryptocurrencies for day-to-day transactions, USDT is actually very popular because people want to go send you $1,000. They don't want to go send you the equivalent of $1,000. Case in point, if you go to Kiev right now and want to go buy a laptop, a lot of the computer stores will happily accept your USDT on something like Tron. And I am sure, and I should say, I have seen this firsthand. I have seen someone in a computer store in Kiev buying a laptop with USDT on Tron. And sure enough, I'm sure the next day they turned around and sent it right back to their supplier to order more laptops. Like, that's a very real world, very useful use case. It actually works. Are they driven by hatred of fiat or thinking central banks is stupid? No, they want their business to work.
Let me make an assertion, I guess, as a final comment. I'd say the average user, to the most vocal user today of Bitcoin, sees Bitcoin as being what they would like Bitcoin to be is an alternative financial system that competes with the status quo financial system. In your view, is that what the technology achieves?
I would say we're doing a very good job of that, precisely because of Lightning.
And in terms of there being more development towards that goal, are we out of the era where we need to make changes to Bitcoin as a protocol?
There isn't a rush to it because we're not hitting.
How do you make that determination?
Well, I mean, one way you can make the determination is how well Lightning wallets work. And I would say they work pretty well. And the biggest issue they wind up having is just how to go deal with fees changing rapidly. And a lot of the fee rates changing rapidly really comes from, ironically, things that Eric Wall and co. were involved in to try to arguably artificially pump up fee demand. Mm-hmm. Now, when you look at inscriptions and all that stuff, I've always thought that probably had a short half-life because it's just not that interesting. It's a fad. Certainly, it was able to go push up fee rates quite high for quite a long period of time. Yet, even in that period of time, Lightning wallets still work reasonably well. And there's a lot of technical stuff we both can do and are doing to improve that. But when you're talking about, say, consensus changes to Bitcoin, well, probably the big thing coming down the pipeline is covenants for the purpose of more interesting types of L2s. ARC is one of your best examples of that. It's different trade-offs than Lightning, and we'll see how that progresses. But, I mean, those guys, I just don't think they're presenting a coherent argument here. It's not like Eric Wall is saying, actually, if Bitcoin protocol worked this way.
That they want they want there to be a fee market, which I think you would like there to be a fee market as well.
Well, that doesn't sound right, because clearly everyone who believes that Bitcoin is going to be secure in the future expects there to be fee market. I mean, that's how you have to pay miners.
There's some divergence in that theory, I would argue.
I would not say there is serious
not amongst the technical
amongst
community.
Anyone remotely competent, unless you're going to go change the economics of Bitcoin in some way by either removing the 21 million limit and replacing with some other mechanism, or through like taxation of transactions. You have to have transaction fees. You got to have a lot of them. That's just there's no debate to be had there. And as long as that's true, we agree that there has to be a fee market. Now, I think I'd say my criticism of someone like Eric Wall is they're not presenting coherent arguments for, say, how Bitcoin could become more money-like in a different technical path, other than maybe activating certain types of opcodes. But that's not really where he's coming from. Summarize, maybe I'd say I think he's just a troll.
Well, spoken from someone who has been accused of that.
Well, I'm a better troll than him. I'm more right than he is.
Well, we're at the Permissionless conference. You've been around. I saw you watching some presentations earlier. What are you looking at? What are you seeing out there from the crypto crowd?
There's been some Bitcoin stuff, but a lot of tech stuff about non-Bitcoin things. Just as an example, like yesterday I was looking at an interesting talk about better sequencers to make MEV more manageable on things like Ethereum. Of course, when I say better, their way of doing things was just use trusted execution technology with like Intel SGX basically to, in a trust-based fashion, do sequencing, so there would be less gas wasted, less transaction space wasted on basically failed arbitrage. And I'm sure that's interesting technical work if you're a Ethereum person, whereas I'd go say from the Bitcoin point of view, it's like, dude, this is why we're trying to avoid doing things that wind up creating MEV on Bitcoin. Some of it may be unavoidable due to the existence of things like BitVM, but some of it's not unavoidable because obviously people, for instance, want OpCat to be able to build this type of structure on top of Bitcoin. We don't have to turn on OpCat. This is a choice we can go make.
Where does this, intellectual effort, human capital effort, like where does it go if Bitcoin doesn't accommodate it in some way?
I mean, some of this stuff, I think it really goes nowhere because a lot of what people want to do is stuff that economically doesn't make much sense to begin with. Lending protocol, like decentralized lending is, I think, a good example of this. People seem to have this idea that decentralized lending is going to be this enormous thing, whereas what I would go say about it is what actually is the economic value of this. Lending is clearly an economically valuable activity, but lending in the economically valuable way requires human identity. A very interesting example of this is some of the biggest forms of lending out there is actually net 30, 60, 90-day credits between companies and their suppliers. Now, why is that such a big industry? Well, because, if you go make bricks and I go buy bricks to build houses, you probably have a better idea about my creditworthiness than the average bank because you're in the same, or at least a similar industry as me. You build bricks, I build houses. You have a reasonable idea how many bricks I'm likely to go and buy from you later, and it's much more reasonable for you to offer a competitive interest rate on, all right, I'll give you your money in 60 days. That's a huge industry. It's kind of hidden because it doesn't actually show up easily, but when you're talking about credit, that's actually, depending on what country you're talking about, one of the biggest sources. Does that sound like something we can put on a blockchain? No, absolutely not. The value we're giving each other there is purely a human relationship between one company and another and its employees, and you just can't digitize that in a way that translates to smart contracts. Maybe we can digitize it in a way that translates to accounting. All right, maybe there's some mechanism through software where we can write a better contract so that if I don't pay you for your bricks, we'll take it to a judge, and the judge will, in a more efficient way, be able to say, all right, who owed what? But that's not the dream of, DeFi. That's like the dream of accountants.
Conflict between Bitcoin and crypto alive and well. This has been a conversation with Peter Todd here at Permissionless 4. We'll see you next at DAS and London Digital Asset Summit later this year. You can go get tickets and learn more at blockworks.co. Once again, this has been a Blockworks podcast.